But it's very nice to see everyone, and I look forward to meeting some more of you in person at some point, hopefully in the near future. And I will say, as the vice president of the IAFL, International Association for Forensic and Legal Linguistics, I heard some of you were from South Africa, and we are hosting our biennial conference there next summer in Cape Town. So hopefully we can meet up at that point in person. Okay, without further ado, this is a talk that has been a long time in the making. Shauna, I saw you were here. You got a version of this summer in Canada. This is something that I started working on actually as a project from part of our research center at Hofstra. And basically, and I'll go through this as we get started, but basically the state of Montana made parole board data available. I got a small grant to be able to purchase a large quantity of parole board data. And we looked at what was going on in the language that could have been causing some of the discriminatory practices that they had identified. So we worked on this for almost a full year, and I was so proud of the students at the end of this. We approached it from a variety of different methodologies. And at the end, the students presented to the Montana State ACLU, which is the American Civil Liberties Union, who were championing this cause in the state to try to work out what was happening with this discriminatory practice. So this is a refined version of what we did a few years ago, and I've added some more substance to it, and I'm still working on getting some follow-up data so I can do something more longitudinal, which I'll talk about at the end. All right, so to begin, this is an analysis of speech acts in Indigenous parole board hearings. And today I'm going to primarily focus on speech acts. As I mentioned, we covered appraisal analysis and corpus analysis, genre analysis, critical discourse analysis. So we looked at this from a variety of lenses. And this is what I think bears the most fruit. Okay. So the issue that I was mentioning, Montana started identifying the fact that they had a disproportionate number of Indigenous population incarcerated in the state. And if you look at the Native American line here, you can see the US general population versus the US incarcerated population. It's about an equal balance. If you look to the right, which are the Montana state numbers, the Indigenous population in the state of Montana is approximately 7%, yet they made up 17% of the incarcerated population in the state of Montana, which is, we're used to seeing imbalances, but this was a drastic one that they couldn't identify why this was occurring. So they decided to actually legislate some pretty interesting solutions. Many people were doubtful as to whether or not they would be successful in doing what they were aiming to do. So in 2015, they passed 5 statutes. Among them were things that designated that 2 of their 7 roving parole board members, 2 had to be from the Indigenous population, whereas before they didn't have any kind of requirement like that. And at this time too, they did get paid, but they were volunteers. They didn't have to have any kind of formal training to sit on a parole board. And they, like I mentioned, they were 7 members who went around the state to different locations, holding parole board hearings. It would usually be 2 or 3 of them who met at a time and determining the outcome of these hearings. So now they designated 2 specific out of those 7 had to be from the Indigenous population. They required cultural training, so Native American cultural training for all parole board members. And while it's a step forward, we have to recognize that there are 11 different tribes in the state of Montana, all of whom will have individual, unique cultural backgrounds and experiences. So when they say cultural training, it's a step in the right direction, but it's still very broad. And they mandated that all parole board hearings be recorded, which they had not been recorded up to this point. So they couldn't really assess what was happening to create some of these discriminatory practices. And I will say, I was hoping they were going to remain quiet this morning. If they continue, I will put them upstairs. Hold on. Okay. Oh, I'll put them upstairs. My apologies.
Well, if you have pets at home.
Yep, they're like children.
They decided to participate in the session. Probably they had an important question about parole board hearing.
Well, I guess given the topic, cats are okay, right?
Yes, please. I put them outside. We'll see how they do out there. They've gotten really, through the pandemic, they've gotten really used to Zoom. So usually when mom's in this spot, they're quiet. It's Sunday. And they're like, no, mom, it's not your time to be on Zoom. Okay, my apologies. So as I was saying, one of these statutes mandated that all parole board hearings had to be recorded. And for a fee, that the data had to be made available for the public. So this is when I was able to get a small grant, and I collected 150 recorded parole board hearings from the time period of 2015 to 2016. And I will show you in a few minutes the way that I sampled the data. Oops. So just to do background on the structure of a parole board hearing to see kind of what the genre expectations were, what should this genre look like? From previous research, as well as publications from the state of Montana Board of Pardons and Parole, they talk about a pretty specific formulaic outline of a hearing. So we have the opening, and in this portion of the hearing, they review the number of the inmate, the crime type or types, the sentence length or multiple sentences if they're being served consecutively or concurrently, what the parole eligibility date is, just to verify that they are indeed able to be up for parole, and to make sure that they have passed their clear conduct requirement, meaning that they don't have any violations within the previous year of requesting parole. So they couldn't have basically gotten in trouble and been written up in the previous year when they're up for parole. At that point, they will allow support for or against the inmate who, and this is in the form of witnesses. So on some occasions, there are witnesses, say for example, law enforcement. I saw a few where law enforcement came and said, no, this person absolutely should not be let out of prison on parole. They are a danger to society, the heinousness of the crime. This person needs to remain incarcerated. And then the ones that were really powerful were when the incarcerate's family came, or a spouse or children. I saw sometime in some cases the children came, and they were fairly young in some cases. And it was just really touching to hear their stories and their arguments for letting their loved one be released. Then there will be the main content. And this was what I was the most interested in because it had the most variation. So they might ask information about the crime. So why did you do it? What was the context or the situation of the event? What kind of parole plan do you have? So you have to know where you're going, what kind of job you're going to do. Are you going to stay in the state? How are you going to support yourself? And then future conduct. So what are your plans for, there was a lot of substance abuse involved. So what are your plans for remaining sober? How are you going to ensure that this doesn't happen again? And the offender is supposedly, this is directly from an updated Board of Pardons and Parole document. The offender is asked to present his or her plan and explain why they think they should be granted a parole. So this is stated front and center that this is something they will be asked during the parole board hearing. And then the final part of the genre is the closing. And this is where the parole board members speak. They discuss options. It's very odd. They discuss options in front of the person who's requesting parole as if they're not in the room. So it's a very odd process in that regard. They will provide their decision and then they will conclude the hearing. So the framing is very, very formulaic, and I found little variance in regards to that. I was very surprised when it came to analyzing the main content, and we'll get into some of that. So when inmates are planning for parole, there are certain things that they are told to consider. So they need to think about not being a detriment to themselves when they are granted parole, and they need to agree to be a law-abiding citizen, right? They need to say these things verbally, so they're expected to verbalize these. And the board members will consider several things when they're interviewing someone. Their history, so what kind of education did they have? What is their employment history? Was there instance of substance abuse? Did they have a prior criminal record prior to this offense? What has their general behavior been towards law enforcement or family in the past? And what's their general attitude? Are they more of a calm person, or do they tend to be more on the aggressive side? And this is things, like I said, in their history that they're documenting here. Then they look at similar things in the time that they were incarcerated. So attitude towards authority, their conduct, their work evaluations from employers while they were incarcerated. Have they participated in the necessary treatment programs? And basically everyone will be put through a treatment program of some kind. So have they participated in the necessary ones? Have they furthered their own education, maybe getting their GED or graduating from college while incarcerated? And what kind of maturity level have they demonstrated? And that relates a lot to attitude. And then finally, what is their forward view? So again, this is their parole plan. So they need to come in very well prepared to talk about what their family status is. Where are they going to live? What kind of community resources do they have? And I was surprised at how much of a role that one played, where some people were saying they wanted to go back to tribal land to be by their family. The parole board said you can't, because we don't have any programs, any appropriate programs to help you succeed in those areas. So sometimes the decision came down to the fact that there's no community resources there that the parole board found acceptable. So it could come down to something as minute as that, but they're told to consider all of these things. And these are things that are stated that the parole board considers. And research has found that primary reasons for denial is that the inmate lacks remorse, empathy, minimizes their involvement or the crime, fails to take responsibility, and lacks insight into their own criminal behavior. So a lot of these have to do with that notion of remorse. And it's been found that credible demonstrations of remorse seem to be the strongest factor in whether a parole board is going to grant parole or not. And that statements of contrition are vital. And this becomes highly problematic when someone maintains their innocence throughout the entire time they're incarcerated. We can't know whether it's true or not, but many people do, and they will never express remorse for something that they didn't do. So they're in a very difficult position. Do I express remorse for something I didn't do? Or do I want and stay in prison for a much longer time? Or do I say something that I don't believe, which then might look contrived to the parole board, because it is, but it might allow me to be released sooner. So it puts people in a very difficult position. All right, and then finally, these are just some simple do's and don'ts that they are told when planning. Tell the story of the person you've become. Who have you become and how have you grown? How have you changed? Refer to your achievements while you've been incarcerated. So what successes have you had as you've gone through the various programs? Again, what is your plan so that you don't relapse, your support system, and show remorse? Then on their don'ts, don't just say I'm sorry. Use stronger language. Don't refer to the crime as a mistake. Don't mitigate the crime. Don't minimize or deny involvement, and don't blame others. These are very clearly given to the incarcerees as they're preparing for their parole. So these are a lot of things that I wanted to look for to see how they were affecting or impacting the decisions. So I based my research on, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this book. It's Catherine Gruber's I'm Sorry for What I've Done. These are analyses of courtroom apologies, so allocutions. And she lays out 6 different ways that people commonly express remorse. So as part of our internship, we coded for some of these various speech acts. So assessments, which will describe or criticize one's actions, or commitment, taking responsibility, expressions of responsibility, expressions of harm. So describing the actual harm caused to someone else. And then even more closely related to remorse are expressions that directly include a canonical sorry, or canonical apology, I apologize for, and then other feelings related to both of those that might not be as canonical in form. So a personal response expressing regret. So it might use words like, I regret such an action, I'm ashamed, I feel repentant. We looked for all of those in terms of coding for remorse. And then not only has research found this, but I based some of this on my own experience too. So Gruber and others have found that people's judgments, and again, she was looking at judges, but here we could substitute parole board members, are notoriously bad at assessing the meaning of another person's affective display. So how do we understand, especially cross-culturally, how do we understand someone else's true feelings about something? And I spent a year in this amazingly beautiful place. This is the Navajo Reservation in the corner of Arizona and New Mexico. I was able to live in Lukachukai, which is the teeny tiny village. I don't know if you can see it at the very bottom of the screen in the left-hand picture, and right at the base of the Chusca Mountains. And for those of you who know a bit about me, my very first puppy, who I memorialize in my locket, his name was Chusca, which means dichotomy, because one side of the mountains is what you see in the bottom corner. The other side is lush and green and vibrant, what you see with the aspens on the other side. So Chusca was a husky golden retriever who had the best of both traits. He could be terrifying and chase away a fox, and then he was also afraid of dandelions. So he embodied both sides of the dichotomy of his personality. But one of the things that I learned when I was there for a year, I was taking Navajo with the elementary school kids, and by week 6, they were talking up a storm, and I still couldn't hear the tones. So I was very far behind. But one of the things that I learned is Navajo has no word for sorry. they don't express remorse very verbally. Oftentimes what they will do is they will, for a true demonstration of remorse, they will bring food. They will bring a rug. They will watch the children. They will provide something, or seeds for planting. They will provide something that's valuable to them to demonstrate their remorse. So I was very curious, and when I started looking around, there are a lot of Indigenous languages that don't have those kind of canonical expressions of sorry. So I wanted to investigate in what ways do expressions of remorse linguistically manifest in inmate statements, and what effect do they seem to have on parole board decisions. And I hypothesized that they would potentially look very different than what our canonical expressions of apologies or showing remorse would be. And I will say I was shocked to find my findings. So for those of you who are students, I'm giving you a shout out right now. Your hypothesis does not always need to be supported. It's equally fascinating when your hypotheses are not. And then it opens the door to further investigation. So always embrace your hypotheses and don't try to change it the last minute. Stand by it. All right, so going back to the data, I did a match sampling. As I mentioned, I got 150 parole board hearings. For this particular project, I took 60 of them. And so we have 15, and I'm here using AA is Anglo American. I used AI, American, which didn't have the same meaning then as it does now, I'm realizing. But for American Indian, and I do use the phrase American Indian because that's what I was taught when I lived on the Navajo reservation, is they said, that's who we are, call us Navajo first, but we are not Native Americans, we are American Indians. So that is the term that I use out of respect. So 15 were Anglo American who were denied parole, 15 were American Indian who were paroled, and I matched them for gender. There were very few female incarcerees, so I did get a few of those in my broader sample just to look at, but for this I specifically kept it to males. I matched them for crime type, as close in age as I could get, and parole eligibility date. So they had to be eligible for parole around the same time. So there were 15 Anglo Americans who were denied, 15 American Indians who were granted parole that were matched, and then the reverse, 15 Anglo Americans who were granted parole and 15 American Indians who had been denied. So to try to look at similarities except for the parole board outcome. As I mentioned, I wanted to keep the crime type as close as possible. So the number of things related to violent crime, I found 60 of those that I could get that good sampling, that matched sampling. So these included things like sexual assault, assault with a deadly weapon, homicide. And we coded, and then I refined over the years. We coded for the Gruber speech acts of remorse. And we did a lot of this in the internship, the research internship with the students. And then over the following 2 years after that, I did inter-rater reliability coding with a separate small group of students to make sure that we are coding everything accurately. Okay, so one thing that I was really shocked by is how few times the incarcerees were given the opportunity to even talk about all the things that they were told they were going to have to talk about. So here are the openings, right? So this is that first section we saw in the genre outline, where the parole board will ask for general information, go into the main section, and open up the floor for the incarceree to talk. So here, out of 15, it's an average of about 7.5 times. It's only about half of the hearings total where they were even asked to talk about their crime, let alone asked about their remorse for it. So sometimes the incarcerees tried to get this in, and I'll show you the breakdown of that in just a minute. But on the half the occasions when they were asked, these are some examples, I just want you to tell us about the crime. It was a really serious, scary kind of crime. Tell us about it. Or tell us about your crime. The point of SOP2, that's one of the programs that they have to go through. That's the sexual offender program, is take responsibility for your crime, right? So there were openings like this that were very directly saying, tell us about what happened. But you can see the way this is organized over here. The green, both of the greens are the Anglo Americans. That's supposed to be an asterisk, a messy one. So the greens are the Anglo Americans, the one that's solid, they were granted parole. The ones that is checked, those are the ones who were denied parole. And then the pink are the American Indians, the solid, they were granted, and the checked, they were denied. So in situations, the highest one is the American Indians denied. That's the one where they were asked the most number of times about their parole plan and their option for showing remorse, and they were denied the most number of times in those instances. So then once we did get into situations where they were allowed to speak, and again, I'm using the same color coding here so that we have ease of reference. When they were asked about their crime and they were allowed to express, or in some situations they weren't asked about their crime, but they knew they were supposed to be talking about this. So they tried to, get it in there at some point anyway. There were very, very few instances out of the 15 hearings where they actually used those common forms of linguistic remorse. Only 17 total out of 60 hearings did they use any of the kind of canonical or non-canonical expressions of remorse that Gruber had identified. And again, we're seeing the denieds equal with the Anglo Americans and the American Indians, and a roughly equal in both categories with those who are granted parole. So not the difference that I expected to find whatsoever. And just some examples. I'll let you read through these. And then on to some of the more canonical ones. And there were no canonical apologies, which I found really interesting. So to sum up this part, again, just not a lot of remorse overall. And interestingly, there were 0 canonical apologies from any of the categories of inmates that I looked at. So my hypothesis was definitely not supported. And that raised a lot of questions for me. What else is going on? So revisiting this, I found that expressions of remorse typically occur in non-canonical forms. When they are present, they seem to have little effect on the parole board decisions for either category. So what else might be going on that's causing this big discrepancy in Indigenous people to be incarcerated? So I wanted to look at some other related speech acts, things like denials or promises. And I also wanted to see if the legislation where they mandated cultural training and recording of hearings had any effect on the decisions. So we'll just look briefly at those. Excuse me. So when I was looking at related speech acts, we had what I call the category of admissions. So admitting, agreeing, concurring, and thoughtfulness, hoping, planning, promising. These were taken as good things in the language by parole board members. Then there was quite a bit of mitigating and denials, things that they were not supposed to be doing. So looking at the way that these lined up, and I have our instances of remorse, the summary from that on the far left-hand side. Admissions were quite prevalent, which surprised me because they are admitting to having participated in the crime. Those are the most prevalent. And thoughtfulness, we see in those who are granted parole in both categories, seem to have an effect. But then the interesting part is the mitigation and the denials. That seemed to unduly influence the American Indian parole board decisions. So we see, I think I have a difference between the positives and the negatives. And in the negatives, this category and this category seem to be affected the most. While it doesn't seem to have the opposite effect. So when it's a positive, right, it's not unduly influencing the decisions in the opposite direction. So that's definitely something that I want to go back and look at in more detail. And then to investigate that last question, that last thought that I brought up, has the mandatory recording and the cultural training directly had an impact on parole board decisions? Because the recordings started in 2015, October, November 2015. And obviously there's no recordings, so we couldn't analyze language data from before the recordings happened. But you can go, it exists in every state. There are offender lookup sites. So you can go on any state website and find out information, all the demographic kind of information about an inmate. So we collected data from all the hearings that the state of Montana had between the 6 months before the recording started, as well as all the hearings for the 6 months after the recording started, and did a regression analysis to see if any of the factors were really influencing the kinds of decisions that we were seeing. So the variables, the dependent variable was the parole board decision. The independent, we collected information on the inmate's race, gender, whether or not they had a previous criminal record, if they were noted as having a violent offense or a non-violent offense, the number of crimes, disposition, and that doesn't mean what you think it means. Not like they're a cheery person, but it means, have they satisfied their required state mandated programs, like the sexual offender program or the drug substance treatment program. So whether they had done those successfully. And interestingly, when they are brought into the system, it's noted what their skin tone is. So we thought, well, it's in there. Let's collect it, see what happens. So there were some interesting findings. The ones that were significant before and after were violent offense. So if somebody was convicted of a violent offense, that held the most weight. that's a good thing in my mind, right? So they're incarcerating the people who have had the most heinous crimes. And while the number changed slightly, it was significant both before the recording started and after. The other one is disposition. It's just a basic thing. You have to have completed your mandated programs. That's just state law. They're not even going to look at you if you haven't completed something. So that was significant as well, and that did not change. The one I found the most interesting, so we've got the number of crimes reverses. So while it was not significant before the recordings, it is significant after they started being recorded. So this is something they're starting to pay more attention to. And the one that just is the slap in the face is race. And if you look at pre and the post, we go from not quite significant, but near significant numbers, right? If P is less than 0.05 to almost not significant whatsoever. And I know that the cultural training had not yet started, so it wasn't due to the cultural training. And they also, during this time period, had not yet filled 2 seats with Indigenous board members. So we had one who was just starting, but he was not involved in most of the hearings during these time periods. People do different things when they're being watched. So that's definitely something to follow up on. And the ACLU was very interested to find out how much effect that these laws actually did seem to have. All right, so preliminary conclusions. Not all inmates are given the opportunity to express remorse. So that is something that if they are told to prepare for that and that a lot of weight will be placed on it, they should all be given equal opportunity to be able to share their stories. When they are, it's not clear if the way that they express remorse makes a difference. It does appear that negative speech acts seem to play a stronger role than positive ones in parole board decisions. More research needs to be followed up on there. Extra linguistic factors such as number of crimes, race, the skin tone one didn't change whatsoever. More analysis needs to be done on that. And like I said, this is data that is freely available online. So this is something that can be easily collected without the recordings. And so between 2017 and 2022, when the majority of changes were actually implemented, they established guidelines for parole board members. They did not have a very firm set of guidelines before on what you should consider, what weight you should give certain things during the hearings. They now are requiring their parole board members to be what they call professional members. So they have to have at least one of the following: a college degree in criminology, corrections, law, or related social science, or 5+ years of experience in corrections or law enforcement, something along those lines. And again, while they're working in the right direction, all members must have received training in American Indian culture and problems. I have a little problem with that final word, but at least they are mandating cultural training. And members now serve for 7 years. So they're much more long-term, so they can have a longer time in the role before they're turned over. And they're paid. It's an established job for those years. So they have made some positive changes. And just one follow-up, I've been speaking with the new director of the Board of Pardons and Parole in Montana, and my goal has been to get another set of follow-up data so I can do more of a longitudinal study on looking at the genre, how that's developed, whether inmates are given equal opportunity to express remorse, if that does seem to play more of a role. He has said they've had a lot of problems with their recording. They haven't been able to record on a regular basis due to staffing shortages post-pandemic. So he said, keep trying back. But he said, I'm very aware of the issue. He said, I was brought in specifically to address some of these issues. He says that they've had large success in mitigating the discrepancy in the population, incarcerated population. We'll see. But one of the things I do have on my plate this summer is collecting more of that hearing data that is readily available on the site, and then continuing to see when I can get more hearings to do that kind of linguistic analysis moving forward. So that is my thank you, because Navajo does have the word for thank you. Hey.